Dr. Shweta Chakrabarty. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Shweta. We always appreciate you coming on. So how has climate change played into all of this?
We have to remember that these extreme weather events have been predicted by scientists now for decades. We know that we can anticipate increased frequency and probability of more heat, extensive heat waves, and these types of extreme winter weather type events as well. That's because we are completely changing the dynamics of the planet, and we can't look at historic data anymore to predict what we need to think about is coming in the future. We're basically on a brand new planet. And that is something we need to take into account as we think about how we are going to safeguard ourselves against these types of events in the future. It is related to the planet warming, and it is irresponsible for anyone to say otherwise.
Now, we've actually seen these outages blamed on green energy, but green energy only contributes to about a quarter of Texas's electric system. Can you kind of explain how that works and why it's being blamed on that if that's not necessarily the case?
Yeah, we have to remember that there is resiliency and flexibility associated with renewable sources because it's more conventional energy sources that fuel the centralized electric grid. Okay. And so if you diversify the sources of energy, then you are naturally increasing the flexibility and resiliency of a system. That's a good thing. You're also creating these microgrids, so you're not dependent on these central sources. And Texas has been able to do that. Texas is a really proud deregulated energy state, and its supply and demand for energy is met within the state. And so it's made energy cheap and affordable to residents within the state, and it's been appealing to investors within the US and outside of the US. Those are the pros to all of this. The cons are that it hasn't been able to plug into that central grid for the stability of energy when it's necessary for unprecedented events like what we saw with this severe winter storm. So even though Texas is really prepared for extreme heat, right? That's what you think about when you think about Texas's climate.
Sure.
You don't think about the polar vortex coming down to the lower latitudes this far. But again, that's what you would anticipate with the planet warming. That's what we're seeing happening, not just in North America, but all around the world. And Texas is also prepared for hurricane season. It has the generators ready and available as backup for any sort of disruption to energy transmission from the source to the consumers. But this was a once in a lifetime, or so we thought, event. And so that preparation just wasn't in place. And ultimately, being more renewable, while it helps to diversify sources of energy, in this particular case with Texas, all of the energy sources were impacted.
Yeah, and this, while it seems like a once-in-a-lifetime event, could well happen again, especially with climate change. So then my question to you is, how does this get resolved short-term and long-term?
And we really need to think about this. It's if you actually start to plan for the worst-case scenarios, not only are you building more safeguards and backups into the system and creating better resiliency, right, and energy continuity, you're also doing the role that society needs to play for those most vulnerable. Because if you don't think about the worst case scenarios, those most vulnerable populations will be the ones most impacted in the future, like we're seeing right now. We saw this isn't our first rodeo, no pun intended. I know we're talking about Texas, but we saw this with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We saw this with the wildfires in California. Yeah. We know that these compounding events result in cascading series of disasters and further disruptions, like water, for example, is another disruption that we're seeing in Texas that's really impacting its citizens. And so we have to forecast thinking about these worst case models actually occurring. And there's always going to be upfront costs with this, and that's what's preventing the amount of actual investment required to build in that engineering infrastructure for wind turbines to prevent against this winter type storm, to really weatherize nuclear power plants. We need to be able to protect the energy sources from these worst case scenarios and be able to better forecast what those scenarios could be. Doing that and really putting in that investment up front is going to protect the most vulnerable in the future. And everyone who lives in the United States deserves that. We have experienced stable energy for decades. We don't need to stop offering that now.
Especially with millions of